So a very bad habit that I have is I really like starting my presentations with a big smile. So I want to give you a couple of seconds to go through this one. As it says, it's probably a good idea to keep your brain out of it. So this is the topic of our discussion. We will try to identify together ways to support our leaders in taking good decisions through the advice from our side, which is rational and unbiased. So during this presentation, I will try to give you examples on how to put aside heuristics and biases and some practical tips and tricks. So it all started with Daniel Kahneman. I assume some of you have already read this book. So Daniel started his research from the late 70s on heuristics and biases and the impact that these have on our decision-making process. Using this as the basis, Kahneman was in a position to formulate what is known as the prospect theory, for which he has also received the Nobel Prize. I'm saying all these as an introduction because they are very relevant to what I'm going to present later on, and they will allow us in a way to understand how our brain works. So to give you an example of the prospect theory, imagine you have Sam. Sam is an investor, and he's receiving advice from two consultants, advisors. One of them is Nick, and the other one is John. Both consultants will be providing pretty much the same information, but in different ways. So look at the scenario over here. Nick goes ahead and says, hey, Sam, I highly recommend that you go for fund A that has an average return of 10% for the past 3 years. An average return of 10% for the past 3 years. And Sam goes, well, I propose that you go for fund B because it had above average returns over the last decade, but it has been in decline for the past 3 years, maybe around 10%. So pretty much both consultants provide similar advice, provide similar information, yet some will most probably accept the advice from Nick because there are no negative arguments in there. So the word decline is a word that will influence some to reject the advice from John. So prospect theory assumes that losses and gains are valued differently, and thus individuals make decisions based on perceived gains instead of perceived losses. This is why we also know prospect theory as the loss aversion theory. And all these are the results of heuristics and biases. To give you another example, based on the same research, it has been identified that subject matter experts will tend to centrally bias likelihoods and overestimate severity. So the dark dot on the likelihood scale presents the actual events, the result, whereas the light color presents the estimate. And we can actually see the difference between the two. So research here shows that small probabilities are overestimated, whereas at the same time, large probabilities are underestimated. Once again, the result of heuristics and biases. And according to the brain is the most important organ that you have. This is a pure definition of bias. But let's transition into a more scientific definition of what a bias and what a heuristic is. And I will also give you some examples on that. So a heuristic is a mental shortcut. It's also known as a rule of thumb that allows us to simplify problems and avoid a cognitive overload. And a typical mistake that we do is to unconsciously reformulate the question in our minds and provide a different answer than the one that we would initially anticipate. So imagine you are a project manager and you receive the following question. Will you finish the project on time? your mind at that moment works on a totally heuristic influence way. So you will swap the question with the following: am I currently on track? These are two totally different questions, whereas the second one is much more easier to reply to, because you can go ahead and say, well, I have 2 tasks to complete for this week. Both of them are done. I'm according to plan. But this was not the initial question. The initial question was whether you would complete the project 2 years from now on time. That would entail that you do profound risk management and analysis in order to be able to provide a solid and substantiated reply. On the other hand, when it comes to biases, and in principle, cognitive biases, these are systemic errors in our thinking that interfere in the way we reason, we process information, and on top of all, the way we perceive reality. You have to keep in mind that both biases and heuristics are part of our automatic and intuitive way of thinking. So we do not control them in principle, and they happen without our awareness. Now, to make it even more practical and see how Kahneman analyzes and presents the way that our mind works. So we can pretty much split our brain in 2 parts, the one on the back, which is called system 1, the primitive part of the brain, and the one on the front, which is called system 2. And what's the difference between these 2 parts? Well, pretty much system 1, being the primitive one, being the one allowing us to live throughout the ages, is extremely fast and takes decisions in an unconscious way. So all the process is automatic. It is primarily being used for everyday decisions, but since it is automatic and there is no reflection in the process, it is error prone. In the cases where system 1 is not in a position to provide a good answer to a situation that we're facing, it actually triggers system 2, the frontal lobes. System 2 is slow. It is engaged to take conscious decisions, and it's rather effortful, we could say. So, being a conscious action, it is less error-prone and much more reliable. Linking these to the concept of heuristics that we presented earlier, there are cases where, taking into consideration that system 2 is in principle a bit more lazy, system 1 reformulates the question in order to reply it through an automatized process and avoids triggering system 2. And we should always be in a position to identify this when it actually happens. Now let's go into our project management world, and in particularly in the world of risk management. I will present a tool that we have all come across, especially since you're all here in this conference. So this is a risk matrix, or heat map, or probability impact matrix. It comes with a lot of names just to confuse us a bit. I would say that this is the best tool by far to scientifically share your biases and estimations. Your biased estimation, sorry. And why am I saying this? Because if you do not use this tool properly, it is most probable that you're going to do more harm than good. To give you an example, you have your analysts assess your risks and provide estimations of likelihoods. If you just ask from them to provide you estimations of likelihood by using descriptive terms like very low, low, medium, high, this doesn't mean much. Or in some cases, people perceive this in a totally different way. So for me, a high risk is a risk that has a probability of occurring, let's say, more than 80%. And for somebody else who is totally risk averse, might be a risk that has a probability of occurring higher than 50%. So you really will have to define to the analyst what these terms actually mean. But even in the case where you provide probabilistic estimates, So you calibrate this scale, let's say very low is below 20%, low is from 20 to 30, and so on and so forth. Even in that case, analysts are prone to mistakes because they have a tendency to randomly attribute a probability, and in many cases, influenced by their own biases. And if you do not challenge them back, then the most probable result will be that even these quantitative, in a way, estimations will be erroneous. What applies for likelihood applies for impact as well. There are many that argue that not doing qualitative analysis and focusing on quantitative analysis is a much better practice. Yes and no. The truth is in between. So this tool is very handy as well. It's much better than nothing. It's easy to present and explain and do some discussions around it. It does not require like very sophisticated and specialized expertise. And above all, it can help management visualize complex risk data. So there are some good practices along with this tool as well, but we have to be cautious of all the impediments that it comes with. In the next few slides, I'm going to provide the biases that influence us when we're trying to provide the accurate estimations on probability, likelihood, and impact while doing a risk assessment. So Bent Flyvbjerg has recently published an article where he summarizes the 10 most prominent biases that are apparent in the area of project management. And this is where we're going to focus. And the good thing with Bent Flyvbjerg is that he has consolidated his findings also upon discussions with the Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman. So we have a lot to learn from this new research findings. What Bent actually highlights on his research is that cognitive bias is only half of the behavioral science. The other half is political bias. These two concepts are totally different. Cognitive bias is uncontrolled, is unconscious. We are influenced by it without realizing, whereas political bias is deliberate. When it comes to cognitive biases, if you scan the QR code, not now, you're all going to receive the presentation anyway, you will go to Wikipedia and you will see that there are more than 200 biases enumerated and analyzed there. But what Bent reveals actually through his research is that out of these 200 cognitive bias, 9 appear to be the most prominent one in project management, complemented as well by political bias. And these 10 biases are the ones that are presented on this slide. The QR code actually leads you to the specific article by Bent that you can download. It's openly accessible. So in the next slides, I'm going to present and focus a bit more on political bias because this is a relatively new concept, and then provide some key information on the other cognitive biases with a special focus on optimism bias, which we would like you to remember that this is the most important and the most prominent in most cases of the cognitive biases. So, first one, political bias. It is our tendency to deliberately and systematically distort or misstate information for strategic purposes. It is also known as strategic misrepresentation. Well, this name says it all. We twist the facts in a way that allow us to pass the message that we wish to pass. We could use the expression, the means justify the ends. This should be the simplest definition of the application of political bias. And the only way to address this bias is through cultural shift and also by imposed reference forecasting. This means identifying previous historical information on which you're going to do your benchmark, identify the relevance, and provide actual forecasts. I want to give you a couple of seconds to read this small paragraph from the book of Kahneman. So the time is yours. So in some case, the stated budget is the one that can secure acceptance of the new project. The actual budget will come later on. This can actually be perceived as a collective failure of professional ethics. And there is a mathematical formula linked to that. Underestimate costs plus overestimate benefits, the ideal way to secure your funding. And we have many examples to share here, but we are not allowed to disclose in a way. So moving forward, what you have to have in mind is the following. For small projects that have low strategic importance and no attention from top management, if we have a bias, this in most cases will be a cognitive one, like for example, optimism bias. Whereas in mega projects with high strategic importance, management involvement, then in these cases, if we are biased, the most prominent one will be political bias, and also reinforced by, let's say, optimism bias in some cases. So you have to have in mind that, let's say, in mega projects, in that case, the most prominent bias is political bias, whereas in small projects, the most prominent bias is optimism bias. And now, to define what an optimism bias is. So it is a tendency that we have to be extremely bullish about the outcome of planned actions. In simple words, we overestimate the frequency and size of positive events and underestimate the frequency and size of negative events. Well, this is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because this is a driving force that people that innovate, that people that take risky decisions and come up with breakthrough solutions. Now, like all biases, we have to put a remedy in place. And the remedy in here, in this situation, is to establish a base rate deriving from what we call the internal and the external view. So assess our own project, assess the characteristics of our own projects, and then look outside the world, the sphere of our project, in similar projects around the world, and try to identify relevances and thus derive from them to a more accurate probabilistic estimate. This is an actual remedy for optimism bias, but as we're going to see later on, this is a remedy for most of the biases. So the principal tool that you have in your hand to assess and address most of the biases is establishing a base rate based on inside view, what's the situation in your project, and outside view analysis of similar projects from other organizations in other industries. Now, a subcategory of the optimism bias is what we call planning fallacy. So this is a case where we plan according to the best case scenarios, also known as the EGAP principle. EGAP stands for everything goes according to plan. So we have the tendency here to underestimate costs, schedule, risk, and overestimate benefits and opportunities. And the cause for that is the fact that we actually neglect our base rate, and also we have a false illusion of control. Now, the remedy here is the same as before. Establish a base rate based on internal and external views. Now, this is a bias that will force us to challenge a bit what we know so far. Uniqueness bias. So it's a tendency that we have to see our project as being singular, as being extremely unique. And for that, we are actually being influenced by the same definitions of a project provided by PMI, provided by PM2, provided by any other institution. So in the definition of a project, you're going to see that it is a temporary endeavor designed to put in place in order to deliver a unique product, service, or result. A unique. So we are biased, we are negatively influenced by the definition of the project per se. And being influenced and having that false perception in our minds, we tend to focus only on the inside view. So we will not search, we will not further investigate on the outside view, because we actually believe that what we have is unique and there's nothing similar out there. That's used as point of reference. So what you have to know is that a project can actually be unique in its own geography, in its own time. So you have to build a huge bridge to bring together two parts of land. You're not the only one. This is not the first time this is happening. You can have a look at similar projects around the world at different times and see how they actually evolved and use their mistakes as lessons learned for you. Research findings actually denote that those that perceive that their projects are unique perform significantly worse than everybody else. The remedy here is the outside view. Since being unique, believing that you're unique, you tend to over-focus on the inside view of your project. For those that are aware of the anthropologist Margaret Mead, always remember that you're absolutely unique, but just like everybody else. After having provided the key information on these principal biases, I will just go through the remaining few until we reach the number of 10, which is the total number of biases identified by Bent. So, overconfidence bias, yet another one. It is a tendency that we have to have excessive confidence on our own answers to questions. So we overestimate how much we understand, and we also underestimate the role of chance here. The bad thing is that overconfidence bias is also fed by hindsight bias, also known like the know-it-all effect. We consider that we would have been able to forecast only after the events took place. For expert risk managers that also use scientific tools like Monte Carlo simulation to do their probabilistic forecasting, keep in mind that overconfident bias is in principle also built in these tools. So for example, when you do your Monte Carlo simulation and you assign distributions to risks, we have the tendency to select the distributions that are more convenient for us. Let's say, for example, you use the beta PERT because you only need to put in 3 values: pessimistic, optimistic, most likely. So it's like the concept, I have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. For me, since I have optimistic, pessimistic, and most likely estimations, then the only accurate distribution that I can use is the beta PERT, which is not the case, because beta PERT is a thin-tailed distribution, and research shows that the most relevant ones in most cases are the fat-tailed ones. Another bias that we have to take into consideration is availability bias, where we overestimate the likelihood of events with greater ease of retrieval, or the ones that we can easily recall. The best way to address this the bias is to focus once again on the outside view, taking into consideration that the cause is a limited focus on the inside view. Heading towards the end, we have 3 more biases. Base rate fallacy. So as you recall, we mentioned base rate, establishment of base rate, as the best tool, the best solution, the best remedy to address biases. Yet, in the cases where we fail to properly reference the correct base rate, we're influenced into taking erroneous decisions. The remedy for this case is, for example, complement our inside view with the outside view. Perform premortems, a very well-known tool in risk management, or do reference class forecasting, which is similar to forecasting by analogies. I just received a message that there might be a problem with my presentation. When it comes to anchoring bias, we tend to rely heavily on anchor when making decisions, and in some cases these anchors might be random. So the remedy in this case is to anchor on base rates and not on best cases, and then adjust. Last but not least, escalation of commitment. This is the one that I love the most. It is a tendency that we have to justify increased investment in a decision based on the cumulative prior investment. So what we do is actually focus on sunk costs, focus on expenses that have already been done in order to claim that the project should continue, when we know well in advance that sunk costs should not be taken into consideration in the decision-making process. So to wrap it up, key rules to take into consideration in order to address biases. Rule number 1, slow down. Engage with system 2 purposefully. Rule number 2, properly define the problem and thus avoid being impacted by the heuristics. Rule number 3, put emotions aside. Try to be as realistic as possible. Rule number 4, focus both on your inside view and your outside view, your benchmarking approach. This will allow you to properly establish a base rate. Challenge your estimates. Always challenge your estimates. Have somebody else challenge your estimates in order to be sure that you're not derailing. And last but not least, keep track of your performance in order to continuously improve and calibrate your forecasting skills. George, you switched on your camera at the moment I'm presenting my final slide, so I'm open for your questions by quoting Edward Deming. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So focus on your data, and I'm open to your questions.